Interiors. The very architecture of interior space is going to change dramatically when we move to the Italian Renaissance. We see pieces like this. Now, this is a painting of the Nativity, but it is set in a middle to upper middle class home in Renaissance Italy, and you can see how decorative the forms tend to be, and we'll get to walls and ceilings separate from this. But you get a sense of something that is more intentional than what we see in the Romanesque. Let's compare the two. Now here we see a basic plan of the Renaissance. Here we see the Romanesque on the left. Now the Romanesque, we had this issue of the Great Hall, and in the Romanesque and the Gothic, that Great Hall is a multi-use space. It's being used as a sleeping hall and eating quarters. It's also where you would entertain. So we have multiple uses to a single space. Now, while the kitchen is independent, these other rooms serve a specific purpose, but it's a very minor purpose comparatively when you compare it to the Great Hall. When we move into the Italian Renaissance, each of these spaces will take on their own form, their own function. So you have a room that is set as a bedroom, something we don't typically see in a lot of Romanesque and Gothic architecture. Or you might have a parlor, a place to entertain people, a living room, which would be more for the family to gather, but an informal space. You might even have women's quarters because this is the Renaissance, and, well, there's some issues there, but we won't get into that here. Now, Palladio is our great Italian architect. We've talked about him already. He will have a massive impact on the United States. But when he's working on these structures during the Renaissance, one of his key elements is going to be the use of ratio. Now, he's getting this from the ancient Greeks, who used ratio heavily, especially in their temple complexes, going from a 3-to-1 to a 2-to-1 ratio. He's going to use these ratios within the rooms to make them feel different, depending on what he's trying to do. So, for example, a 3-to-4 ratio is fairly comfortable. 3-to-5, we're pretty close to that human proportion at that point, which is 1.618 to 1. So it's a comfortable space. It's a sort of thing that we would recognize at a very unconscious level. By the way, the same thing has been happening with churches and religious structures for centuries at this point, because we typically use sacred numbers in those places. Now, in the Renaissance, a lot of these structures are going to be built around some round component, maybe a semicircular or circular room, maybe a dome in the center, as we see here. And that creates a complication because, of course, you have to work around that, and working with non-squared structures, non-squared interior space is really tricky. Where do you put a desk? Where do you put a refrigerator when you have a round wall? Now, another thing that he starts with, and we see commonly in the Renaissance, is this idea of really no hallways, every room leading to another room. So as we look at this floor plan, for example, you'll notice that what appears to be an entryway to the home actually has an entryway to this room, which would be a parlor, this room, which would be another parlor. If I go in here, this is probably going to be some kind of private quarters, maybe family space. Here's a large courtyard in the middle. Very, very common in the Italian Renaissance, is everything to do with climate. But as I move through the house, you can imagine some awkward situations where you're actually walking through someone's bedroom. You have to walk through private quarters, etc., to get anywhere if you want to stay inside. And you'll notice not all of the walls actually open, or not all of the rooms actually open into the courtyard. Palladio gets around that by developing hallways. He's really sort of the first to do that. And what you typically see is a passageway that's dedicated. It's intended simply as a passageway, usually leading to the largest hall or room in the house. And that's what we see here, these passageways leading into a large domed structure. So it's really the Italian Renaissance and Palladio that we can thank for all those hallways that we deal with to this day. Now, one of the other things that we see a lot is his use of niches and other recessed spaces. Now, sometimes these are very low and they can act as a small storage space or a space to put a sculpture. In other cases, it's put in to give a sense of dimension to a wall. Some of these are painted, some of these are trompe l'oeil, in other words, trick the eye. It's a painting that's meant to look three-dimensional, even though it's two-dimensional. But either way, we tend to see these niches used, and they give a sense of rhythm to a space, especially a hallway or a large room, as you see on the left.